Okay, we're going to get into the Civil War this unit. This is going to be Unit 9. And we're going to start with the causes of the Civil War. So as we go through these notes, what I want you to do is underline anything that applies to the South, and I want you to box anything that applies to the North. If you have highlighters and would rather do it with highlighters, you could pause, grab your highlighters, and just as long as you know what each thing means, that's all that matters. So tariffs. Now, tariffs make manufactured goods more expensive if they're made outside the United States. So what region will want more protective tariffs? The North, the moneymaker, is through producing things like clothing. In the South, the moneymaker is growing forms of cash crops, mainly cotton. The North is benefited by tariffs as it makes their products cost less than those that were shipped from other countries. So what this means is people in the South and people in the North, if a product is shipped from overseas, it would be cheaper normally. So let's say that a shirt is $10 when it's shipped from overseas, but products made in America would have costed $15 here. Well, what the United States was doing was that was putting a tax on those products that were made in other countries. So that $10 shirt is now really about $15, $16 once they put that tariff on there. So it makes the American products cheaper. The offside to that is that the South is going to be hurt because they have to increase what they pay for those manufactured goods. And it benefits them none because they're not getting any of the money from that, whereas the North is at least benefiting. Yeah, it causes their prices to increase, but it also gives them more money too, so it helps the North. So states' rights. Southern states believed they had the right granted to them to overturn any law. So this is that thing called the nullification crisis that we talked about all the way back in Jackson. They believed that they could nullify any law that they didn't agree with or overturn any law they didn't agree with. The Southern states believed they could overturn these federal laws, and this really causes a big power struggle in between the state governments in the South and the federal government, even though federalism means that the federal government is above the state government and state government is below. So abolition versus slavery. The North is free for black people and mostly opposed slavery. They're abolitionists. The South supported slavery as they needed it for their economy. They grew cotton, and cotton is extremely hard to pick to separate from the seed. So they needed these slaves so they wouldn't have to pay employees to pick this cotton. Cotton also goes for cheaper than these t-shirts did. So on average today, a t-shirt sells for $10. Only about 10 cents of that $10 is going to a cotton farmer. The rest of it is going to that cotton manufacturer that would have been in the North. So really these plantation owners, yes, they were wealthy, but the ones who were small time didn't make much money because they didn't grow much cotton. The big plantation owners obviously made a lot of money, and they made even more money because they didn't have to pay their employees. Uncle Tom's Cabin was a book written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Now, what Harriet Beecher Stowe did is she started talking to former slaves that had escaped on the Underground Railroad, and she took their horror stories. So let's say she talked to 25 slaves. She took the worst thing that happened to each one of those slaves and turned them into one character. So it was an anti-slavery book. It was depicting the life of a slave. It was a fictional slave character. It was based on the life of slaves. But imagine the worst day of your life happening every single day. That's what she depicted in this life of a slave. So this is actually going to enrage both sides of this, because you have some slave owners in the South that are like, whoa. I don't treat my slaves like that. I don't, torture them and cut out their tongues and break their ankles every single day. That doesn't happen. And then you had people in the North that had never heard a slave story, and they're like, oh my gosh, this is horrific. How could this be happening every single day to these people and nobody's doing anything to stop it? So it's going to spread very, very fast, and it's going to spark major outrage. It was actually the #1 seller at that time, and it was the first book that replaced the Bible as the #1 seller in the United States. All right, so abolition versus slavery, the acts that follow it. So we're going to go back to when the 5th president of the United States Monroe was in office, the Missouri Compromise happened. This is when Missouri was entered as a slave state and Maine was entered as a free state. It kept a balance in the Congress between free and slave states. The one thing they didn't want is they did not want free states having more senators or more representatives than the slave states, and vice versa. They wanted to have equal representation between these two ideas of being an abolitionist and being a slave state. The Compromise of 1850, it's going to enter California as a free state, Texas is going to enter it as a Maine state, and the rest of the Mexican Cession is actually going to enter as popular sovereignty, so they can vote and decide whether or not they want to add slaves to their state. And it also added the Fugitive Slave Act, which satisfied the people in the South, because the Fugitive Slave Act pretty much prevented escaped slaves from being able to ever live freely in the United States. It's what made the Underground Railroad have to go all the way up north to Canada instead of just going to a northern state. So what this meant is you could be an escaped slave, and you could be escaped for 20 years, and you could be near the end of your life, and you could have a wife and kids, and then all of a sudden a slave catcher comes in, takes you back to South Carolina where you were a slave. It didn't matter what the laws in that state were. They were legally allowed to capture you and take you back. The Kansas-Nebraska Act gave those states the ability to vote over the issue of slavery. So Kansas and Nebraska at the time were territories. They weren't states yet, but once they became states, they were able to vote over slavery. So what you're going to have is you're going to have a bunch of people moving to Kansas and Nebraska in order to vote on this issue of slavery, whether or not these states were allowed slavery. Okay, so now we have bloody consequences. Going back to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, you're going to have passionate people on both sides of slavery arguing and flooding to Kansas to vote on this issue. So you have people from the north that are super abolitionists that would literally pick up and move their entire family just so that way they can vote against allowing slavery in these states. And then you have people from the south moving west so that way they can spread slavery. And you have these people living side by side. What do you think is going to happen? They're going to fight. And this is what's called Bleeding Kansas. And it happened in mostly Kansas, but it was a result of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Nat Turner's Rebellion. I love talking about Nat Turner. Nat Turner was a slave, and he basically got this premonition from God that said, you're going to lead a slave rebellion. You're going to lead your people, kind of like Moses. The idea of Moses came to his head while he was sleeping, and he said, you're going to lead your people. You are going to lead these slaves away from this horde land, and you are going to lead them north. And in the process, people are going to die. And in this premonition from God, he says God tells him to wait for a sign. So he's waiting, and he's telling all his people, hey, get ready, we're going to leave. We're going to rebel. We're going to take our people up north. And he's waiting for the sign, and he looks up in the sky one night when he's walking back to his quarters, and he sees the harvest moon. It happens every single year. It happens normally in the fall months, so that way you know to harvest your crop. And he sees that, and he takes it as a bloody moon, and he says that's the sign from God. So he riles up all of his followers, and he goes through and he murders 55 people, including his master's kids. And then what he does is he takes all of his people and he grabs all the weapons that he got from his master's plantation home, and he takes them to the next plantation, and he goes into the plantation and he finds the slaves that are there, and he's like, hey, we're going to go. I'm going to lead you to the promised land. We need to kill as many people as we can on our way there. And so they kill those owners, and then they go on to the next plantation, and so on and so forth. Eventually he is stopped, and he is hung along with all the other slaves that participated, or many of them were hung. Some of them were just like their foot was chopped off, or something that they were able to survive, but many of them also died. So more than 55 people were killed, the slaves were also technically murdered because they didn't even get a trial, but I mean, they were guilty of that. John Brown's raid on Harper Ferry. This was a violent protest to oppose slavery, and he was stopped by the Marines, and he ended up being hung for treason pretty much right on the spot. I don't think he got a trial either, but this took place in the West as well. So Dred Scott v. Sandford was a Supreme Court case. Dred Scott was a slave from Missouri. His owner moved him and his wife, so he moved Dred Scott and he moved his own wife to Illinois. Well, Illinois is a free state, so technically he should not have been allowed to have a slave. Well, when this owner died, you have what's called a will, and in this will it lists everything that you own, and it lists who that property or who that item now belongs to now that that person's dead. So this attorney is going through every single thing that this man owned, and one of the things that's listed is a black male slave named Dred. And that man was going to go to his eldest son. And this lawyer is sitting there and he's like, wait a second, black slave, we live in Illinois, that's illegal. There shouldn't be a slave in any of this paperwork. So he goes to visit the wife of Sandford, the man that died. He goes to visit his wife, and his wife's like, yes, this is our slave, this is Dred Scott. And the attorney is like, well, you shouldn't have a slave to begin with. And Dred Scott comes and tells him, I would like to petition for my freedom. And the attorney is like, if you would like to do that, I will help you. So the attorney and Dred Scott sue Mrs. Sandford, the widow of Mr. Sandford. And it took it all the way up to the Supreme Court. So what the court decided is that first, Dred Scott had no right to sue. He had no right to take his case to court because he was a slave. Slaves aren't United States citizens, and you have to be, according to the court at this time, you have to be a United States citizen in order to sue. And that's just not true anymore. You do not have to be a United States citizen to sue. We have non-citizens of the United States that live in the United States that sue people all the time. That are here, obviously, legally. He would have been here legally because he was a slave. But they took it a step further. They also said that anyone that was of African descent can never be considered citizens. So they would never be able to sue. They would basically never be able to have the rights that are granted to a citizen just because they were born African. It was regardless of whether or not they were a slave or they were born free. The election of 1860. So 4 presidential candidates ran in this election. You have Lincoln, Douglas, Breckinridge, and Bell. And I just want to point out, yes, Lincoln was a Republican. Yes, Douglas was a Democrat. But these are not the same Republican and Democrat parties that are today. The political parties actually switched platforms in around the 1960s. So when you hear Republican, that Lincoln was a Republican, that does not mean that the Republican Party today is the same party that Lincoln is. And one of our senators likes to say that that's the case, but it's not. If you look at the ideas of Lincoln and you look at the ideas of the current Republican Party, it's not the same. Same with Douglas. If you look at the ideas of Douglas and you look at the ideas of the current Democratic Party, it's not the same thing. Lincoln ends up winning the presidency, spoiler alert. He lost the popular vote, but he won the Electoral College. President Trump actually did the same thing in 2016. He lost the popular vote, but he ended up winning more states, more Electoral College votes, so he ended up winning the presidency. His beliefs on slavery, he opposed slavery. He ran on the campaign that he was not going to make slavery legal. Have you ever heard the phrase Honest Abe Lincoln? I don't know where that phrase came from because he absolutely 100% lied. He ran on this campaign that he was not going to make slavery illegal, and what does he do once the Civil War starts? He ends up making the slavery illegal. But he was going to prevent it from spreading westward. That's what he ran on. He said, I'm not going to end slavery, but I am going to prevent it from moving westward. This still made Southerners very uneasy, and obviously they had a reason to, because he did end up making slavery illegal later. Not saying he shouldn't or shouldn't have, obviously he should have, but he's saying he wasn't going to, and he ended up doing it. So the South secedes. To secede means that you leave. South Carolina was the first state to secede. They did this because of Lincoln's election. So everything kind of leading up to Lincoln's election, everything else I mentioned, Lincoln's election was just the tipping point. They're like, all right, I've had enough. And as soon as South Carolina leaves, 6 other states quickly follow. Now, if you notice something about the nullification crisis, South Carolina was responsible for the nullification crisis. So it makes sense that 30 years later, whenever this radical Republican, Lincoln, becomes president, it makes sense that they say, oh, we're done, I'm out. We can't take it anymore, we just have to be our own country. Together, these states form the Confederacy, or the Confederate States of America, and the Jefferson Davis becomes their president. So what I want you to do on the back of this current page that you're taking your notes on, so it's going to be the back of page 20, it's going to be 21. I want you to color this map the same as the map that's on your screen. And then I also want you to fill out where it says northeast characteristics, south characteristics, west characteristics. I want you to fill out what types of economy each of these places had. What did the South rely on? What did the North rely on? And what did the West rely on? Along with what kind of lifestyles they have. If you need help, you can use your notes and you can ask me for clarification. And that's all I got for you today.